All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Grad Chat. It's been a few weeks since the last episode, and somehow it feels like it was yesterday, but also 6 months ago. But we're super excited to be back with you and to be talking today about the really interesting period of time in your life where you are finally getting done with grad school and then suddenly trying to figure out what exactly happens next. And the thing is that those two pieces really overlap. So my name is Susanna Harris, and I'm going to kick it over to Faye to introduce our amazing guest of the day.
Hey everyone, welcome to Grad Chat. Our topic today is planning a career, and our guest today is Dr. Matthew Facciani, and he is currently a postdoc researcher at Vanderbilt University. He just graduated with his PhD in sociology from the University of South Carolina this summer, and before that, he was in a different PhD program studying cognitive neuroscience before changing fields. So welcome, Matthew. If you want to say a few words about yourself and why you're interested in talking about planning a career with us today.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much for introducing me and inviting me to your show. It's so great to talk to you both. And basically, I'd like to share what I went through this past year because it was definitely a stressful and challenging experience. And if I can offer any sort of advice or guidance in any way to anyone currently navigating the job market and finishing up their PhD, then I would definitely like to do that.
Awesome.
Do you want to start us out with questions, Faye? I think we have a whole bunch.
A whole bunch. Oh, geez.
Yeah. It was fun. I always love doing the takeovers because, we have our questions, but then it's like, then other people point out things that I would have never asked, but really wish I would have. And here's one. So sure. One of those first questions is how can a person, or how did you practice self-care while on the job market? We all know that this is an extremely stressful time. Yeah. And self-care might be pretty low on the list. Do you have any tips for folks?
Yeah, that's a big one. Honestly, that might be one of the most important things to consider throughout grad school and particularly on the job market, especially if you're finishing up your dissertation while you're doing the job market adventure. As far as actual tips, one big thing I think is to not, as best you can, try not to keep checking for updates. That's one of the first things I'll start. So as soon as you send off your application, just try to forget about it. I know it's hard, but it's only going to cause more anxiety if you keep checking like all the websites, all the rumor websites about like if the flyouts or interviews already taken place. It's really tempting to do that, but it doesn't help. And there's nothing you can do about it anyway, right? So I think that's the first thing that I kind of try to do that, not always successfully, but I think that's like the first broad tip I would give. Yeah.
It kind of goes back to that really big self-care key of accepting what you don't have control over, that, worrying about it doesn't change that outcome. But like you said, definitely easier to say you're going to do that than to actually do it.
Yeah. So as best you can, I would say. And then, just any sort of other general self-care, make sure you're trying to be is the best place you can be before going into it, because it's going to be tough. I mean, even if you're in a great mental health place, going into it, it's still going to take you down. So just trying to be aware of that and be as proactive as you can be, I think will be a good attempt to going at it. I mean, because, people make it through it and you can make it through as well, but it's important to be mindful of how much stress is going to be involved too.
Yeah, absolutely. I just got through this part too, and I got some questions the other day on a panel of how to do this, and I was like, well, I mean, but the thing is that you've had to, you and I have chatted before this, that learning to go through grad school, and I think we'll get to this in some questions, but a lot of the learning you do is how to practice self-care when it feels like it's impossible.
Right. Absolutely. So I think that's important to reflect on, as you've already done so much and you've already accomplished so much. And this is just taking it a step further in some ways, but try to reflect on other times when, it seemed really difficult, like starting grad school is really overwhelming, for example, and you made it over that. So trying to reflect on those accomplishments, I think, can be helpful too.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
Yeah, these are all such great tips. I think if I were to like sum up one of the things that I got out of those points, one, be aware of things that aren't within your control and don't internalize them as a reflection of you. And
right.
two, try your best, put yourself out there, and just be kind to yourself when you are doing the best that you can. There are things you can't control, but I can be kind to myself for putting myself out there. And I think that's so important to explicitly say, because in the moment it's definitely, there's a lot of struggle and maybe a lot of like negative self-talk when it is a tough process to go through. So this is just so important to just explicitly talk about. We have, let's see, if we want to go on to some of these other questions that we have. This one says, how do you know what kind of jobs to apply for? And how did you deal with the anxieties around the lack of academic postdocs or jobs or other jobs?
Yeah, it's a big one. So for me, I really thought I wanted to be a professor, and I still do. I think given my strengths and my passions, that's something that I knew I wanted to apply for. So I applied to basically any kind of tenure track faculty position that was available. And I'm in sociology, so anything that was broadly aligned with my field. Then I can talk more about the intricacies of applying to faculty jobs too. But I think really just trying to think about what brings you happiness and what you can see yourself doing, and just try your best to apply to those. I mean, academia is challenging because there's so few jobs, and that is only becoming more true now with COVID. But for me, even though academia has its issues as well, I was pretty focused on still trying to go that route, at least for the beginning, and seeing if I could land anything, because it's just super competitive. So I guess another point I'll say, kind of related to the last question too, is that, and kind of what you were saying, Faye, about just try not to taking it personally about the process, because there's so many applicants and there's like hundreds of applicants for one spot. So a lot of it's just luck, and you might be a great applicant and they may very well want to hire you, but they can only hire one person. And ultimately it's just these weird subjective differences, like, well, this person published a paper that we think is kind of cool. And that's literally might be the difference between who gets a job, is just like subjective preferences on one paper. So I just wanted to mention that too.
Yeah. And, you know, there's some questions here. And so this is a great question that came in. It says, is it true that it's harder for social science PhDs to find jobs outside of academia? How can you market your skills? To kind of lead into that, though, I would love to learn more about how, you know, what kind of jobs exist for somebody who's coming out of social sciences. Like, you're wanting to go towards the professor route, which, like, heck yes, we need more awesome people in academia and people who are willing to talk about this. But like, what options even are there?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess I'll kind of briefly summarize kind of the timeline of where I was last year. So the academic job schedule is kind of like a year in advance. So if you're applying to jobs now, it's for fall 2021. So I applied to those jobs first, and I got some interviews, which I can talk more about the interviews if people are interested in that. I got close a few times, but I didn't get any offers. And then COVID hit in March, and I still didn't have any offers. And all of a sudden, all the academic jobs were evaporating. I kept getting emails saying, we're sorry to let you know that the job you applied for is gone and we can't hire anybody anymore. So at that point, I was like, well, maybe academia isn't a viable choice. And I already knew that it was very difficult anyway. So it wasn't like this too much of a big surprise, but definitely still challenging. So I did spend like a solid month on the non-academic job market, because at this point I was like really worried about academic jobs, and I spent a lot more time on it because I was already kind of looking for industry jobs, but it was definitely secondary for a while. But for a while after COVID hit, I actually made a resume. So that's the first tip I'll start off. That was the first resume I made in years. Like for a while, I just had my CV. And I would definitely recommend like looking at other resumes, talking to people in industry, and like just trying to convert your CV stuff into resume stuff, because the language is different, even though you're basically doing the same stuff. They want to know the skills you've learned in your resume. So that's definitely important. But to finally get to the question I was asked, what kind of jobs are there for social scientists? There's a lot of researcher jobs. So for lots of companies, they want someone to run research on all kinds of things that deal with people. So it can be like employees, right? So like one of the jobs I applied to was with Google, looking at the happiness and well-being of Google employees to make sure that they're doing better and ultimately more productive. That's what they're interested for the bottom line, but they cared about their happiness and well-being of employees. So as a social scientist, I'd go in there and run some studies and complete some surveys on how people were feeling and how to improve the work environment. So that's a big part of it. So for any big company, they are going to want social scientists to come in and improve workplace morale, basically. In addition to that, there's also jobs that you're doing research for the company, not just on the employees, but what the company's interested in. And I did have a couple callbacks with big tech companies, and I had a interview. I actually made it to the interview stage on a couple of these tech companies. One's a major social media platform that I won't tell you, but it's very big. It rhymes with, no, I'm not even gonna say it. I don't even know if it matters, but I mean, it was fine. It was a fine experience. They were all very nice, but basically the interview was very challenging because it was like a rapid fire stats questions for an hour.
No.
And that's what they wanted. They wanted me to go in and do a bunch of studies and just like really just pump out a lot of research in it, as quick as I can. And that's kind of some of these big tech companies that hire social scientists. It's a very fast-paced environment. It's very different than academia. So that's one thing that I learned. And some people may like that. It seemed kind of stressful for me personally. And so definitely bigger companies will also be able to hire PhDs like right out of school because they have the resources to kind of train you a little bit too. Mm-hmm. So if you're interested in looking at like specific companies, smaller companies, I was told that like they liked my resume, but they just really need someone with industry experience first. So big tech companies, large company, any type of company, you can look at researcher, data analyst, like search those in Google jobs or higher ed jobs or any sort of search engine that deals with careers, and you'll find some. So yeah.
I wanted to follow up with that of like, did you know that these jobs existed before you started looking, or how did you find out? Was this just like, okay, LinkedIn, please help?
A little bit of both. So like most PhDs, the focus really wasn't on non-academic jobs. I think that's unfortunate. Part of the process is like for so long, it's just they kind of train you to be a researcher in academia. I did get a little bit of help, and I talked to a few different people who were academics and then went into industry and just kind of picked their brain a little bit. And that was really helpful. So I had a couple ideas that basically I thought tech companies might hire me, or at least, have jobs available for me. So I did have an idea to look for, big social media companies. It was kind of the first one I looked at, but yeah, I would definitely learned a lot. And I learned that it's really broad. So again, if you type in researcher jobs in like LinkedIn, you're going to find a lot of people specifically looking for social scientists, both quantitative and qualitative analysis.
This is all really insightful. Like I know as someone who's still in grad school, and I can really feel that effect of when you're in grad school, there's just not that much talk of non-academia job routes. And there are a lot of questions about like, how do I look for this job? What kind of jobs are out there? What is this interview process looks like? And it does feel like from what I'm hearing, it is a lot of initiative on your end to kind of figure out that process.
Yeah.
Where in grad school, you're not really prepared to, for example, you mentioned how to write a resume in a way that is fitting for the application process. And there's so many logistics that is so important to talk about and stay informed about during this whole job search. So I think, let's see, one of the questions here is that people are interested in what the interview process looks like, which can differ depending on the job. But I think if you want to speak more about, and you already, I think, did speak a little bit about some of your interview experiences.
Yeah.
But are there things that that struck you, or things that you wish you would have known going into the interview process that would have helped you be more prepared? Or how was the interview process for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll break it into academic interviews and non-academic interviews. It might be a little bit easier. So I had a couple, so I'll start off when I was first applying to these academic jobs, I got a few phone interviews. And usually how it goes is you do a phone interview, and then if you make it to the next round, there's an on-campus interview, or in COVID times, it's just kind of a final interview. So basically the phone interviews, they just want to ask you about your research. And I think the key is to express interest in why you applied there. So you definitely want to do your homework as far as why you're interested in that school. There's different types of universities, right? So like there's like the big R1 research universities. So you want to sell yourself as a researcher. If you're applying to small liberal arts colleges, you want to sell yourself as someone who really cares about teaching. So that's really important for the interviews to get those points across. As far as the interviews I had, I didn't really have any too confusing questions. They're pretty straightforward. They just want to ask me about my research. I will say, kind of related to the earlier point about self-care, after you do an interview, also just try not to think about it, because you may not hear from them for a while. I'll share a story. This was my first interview. It was a phone interview for a tenure track job at a great school on the West Coast. And I thought it went really well. And the person interviewing me on the phone literally told me, "This is a really great interview. I think you'll be a great fit for our department." So I'm like, wow, that must have went really well. And I didn't hear anything back for about a month. And I found out they, sent people out to fly and visit the campus. So I'm like, oh, well, I didn't make it. And I didn't hear anything back for another 6 months after that until I got a generic rejection email. So even if you have like a really great interview, you might not hear back, and it doesn't feel good, but just to be aware that that's what happens. And sometimes there's like HR reasons why they can't let people know, or different reasons for that, or if they're just sometimes they're overwhelmed and they don't have an opportunity to email everyone that applies. But definitely be mindful of that whenever you do have interviews. Even if they go well, you might not hear back for a long time. And usually that means you didn't get the job. If it's like a month goes by and you didn't hear anything, just move on. The converse is also true. Sometimes I had an interview, this was in the spring. So I had an interview at another tenure track job, and I actually got it to the final stage. So I had my final on-campus interview all scheduled. I was getting my talks ready. I was super excited. It was a great fit. And then they told me the search was suspended due to COVID-19 and they weren't hiring anybody. So that was really crushing. I was really bummed about that. And then I had another interview like the day after I found out about that for a visiting assistant professorship. And I was in a terrible state, and I thought I totally bombed the interview, but they invited me to the second round for that job. But I ended up not getting that job anyway. And one of the questions they asked me, so for that job, the visiting professorship, they asked me, it was supposed to be on campus, but at that point it was COVID times, and you could kind of tell the professors were adapting, and just trying to like think of good questions. I remember the first question the professor asked me was, so tell us more about the statistics in your dissertation, like the p-values, effect sizes, and he kind of trailed off. And I'm like, what do you mean? So like I think he didn't really know how to formulate the question, and it came out kind of awkward. So I don't think I answered it super well, because I'm like, I don't remember what the specific p-values of my dissertation was. So be aware that even though these are professors and, you know, we look up to them sometimes, like they're still trying to figure stuff out, and they have their own stuff going on in their lives. And sometimes they may not be prepared or on top of it either. So so that was kind of a smattering of stories. I hope that was kind of helpful.
I think that was really helpful. I just like that you keep going back to the point of like, don't overthink it. And that, you know, there's so much that is just totally out of your control, and
Right.
that you will never know why they said no. Related to this, we have one from Rob at Phonetical, which I have an opinion on this, but asking, is it a good idea to record your interviews to see how they went, or if you could improve? So let's say it's possible, especially right now, you know, you're not going in person.
Right.
If you did like a screen cap or something else, or even just recorded your voice, what would you think about doing something like that so you could improve interview?
So I guess this is assuming they allow you to interview, to record the interview, because sometimes they specifically say, don't record this, it's not allowed. So,
yeah, I think that's a big piece, right? You really want to, that's not a good way to start out a new job.
Yeah. So definitely make sure it's okay, because that could be a tricky thing, because sometimes they talk about sensitive information, especially again with these big tech companies. I know the one I interviewed with, they said, do not record this, don't tell anybody that, like, you know, that you're doing this. Like they wanted to be they wanted to be very secure about it. So yeah, definitely. So assuming you can, let's say you can for some reason, I don't know if it'd be that helpful, honestly. I think it'd be helpful to like remember what you said and remember what they asked, and then maybe talk to your advisor about it afterwards and be like, hey, they asked me about my research, and, you know, I said this. How do you think that was a good answer? And maybe your advisor would be like, well, they might have been looking for you to say X, Y, Z. Again, this kind of goes into academic versus non-academic jobs, because you will talk about your research very differently depending on the job you interview with. So for non-academic jobs, you want to be very direct, very concise, and no jargon. So as soon as you start using jargon, you're gonna lose them. So don't do that. But as far as academic jobs, yeah, you definitely want to talk about how your research is important to the academic literature, and how you'd be like an exciting hire for them. You sell yourself academically. But again, for non-academic jobs, they don't care about publications at all. They just care about your skill set. So,
yeah, I would say they followed up with like, what is your meaning? Like, what was my opinion? Because I was like, I have an opinion. I think it's really hard to focus in an interview, especially in like a video phone interview already. And the idea of having an additional thing in my mind of like, oh my gosh, I'm recording this for the future, that would really throw me off. I don't know that it would throw everybody off, but, you know, definitely what you were saying of like trying to remember it. And if you're looking to improve, I think it's also a really good idea just to practice with an advisor or with somebody, you know, or ideally a career advisor, because they are not going to be as critical of you as you probably are of yourself. And they're also going to find pieces that you thought went great, and they're going to be like, not that part.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, Matthew, I like how you brought up that interviews are also so different, and that they're very individualized, and that it's nice to, I mean, having the option to record and reflect on how it went can be productive in certain ways, but also keep in mind that interviews can be very different, and what worked here might not work in a different type of interview. So that's I think an important point that I didn't immediately think about either, especially as someone who has yet to go through this process of what seeing different interviews are like, or looking for a career. It's cool. Let's see, we have another question here. So Saad Rasul says, when people leave academia for industry, they are often considered to be greedy, and brings up that they say, I think there's so much more to industry than just the financial incentive. For example, more research funding, faster pace. So it seems like people are curious about maybe the perception of what different careers are like, and maybe how did that play into your journey in planning a career?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I do think there is some bias in academia against going outside of academia when you finish grad school. I think it's changing a lot over time, especially with younger faculty realizing the nature of the job market and how there's just not a lot of academic jobs, and it doesn't make sense to prepare everyone for academic jobs. But there is still some people that I know in particular working for these tech companies. Again, that's where I have the most experience. That's why I keep talking about it. I know some social scientists will view it as like selling out, because you do get paid more if you work for Facebook or Twitter than you would as a faculty for a lot of places, especially smaller schools. But there's a lot of advantages too. Like, having more money is definitely an advantage, but sometimes the work-life balance can be better. You're there 9 to 5 sometimes, instead of like, on a tenure clock where you're like really stressed out trying to get tenure. So as far as like the perception, I think it's really unfortunate that there is any kind of bias, because I wish faculty in particular would just be happy for their students if they find a career that's meaningful to them. Like that's what it should be about, right? So as best you can, I think just try not to worry about people who are looking down at your choices, because ultimately if you're doing something that makes you happy and you're passionate about it, that's what matters, as long as you're not hurting anybody.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting of the kind of push of like, oh, it's, you're a sellout if you go there. But what you were just saying is, at no point did you say, and then I realized I could make a lot of money, so then I looked at industry.
Right.
I think that, yeah, money is a nice thing, but the other reality is that, like, if academia is so great and phenomenal, and the only people who leave are like selling out and whatever, it wouldn't make sense that we meet amazing people out in the business world.
Right.
And if it was such a utopia, why would we want to keep people in it? Right? Like, why it would just be very easy of like, oh, I wouldn't recommend you go because I think there's some really amazing stuff here, versus like, those people who leave are bad guys.
Right.
So yeah, it's definitely something that I've gotten of like, oh, you just didn't care about research anymore. And I'm like,
yeah,
my job actually allows me to help other researchers. And it sounds like the stuff that you were going to do potentially in some companies was actually going to be improving people's lives at companies. It's a different field, but I don't think, I certainly didn't hear from you like, and then I realized I wanted money.
No, not at all. I mean, especially if you look at like the research, once you make a certain amount of money and you have your financial needs met, that's really where happiness seems to have the biggest impact. But yeah, as far as industry jobs, a lot of it, I was just trying to do something that I thought was interesting. So doing research in some capacity or helping people. But I guess, the thing about money I will say is sometimes you get offers that are very low. And that's where I think it is kind of an issue. Like if you're in school for this long, for example, there is so I applied to work at a museum. That was another job that I applied to work at. And it sounds great. I mean, it sounds awesome, but it was near San Francisco, and they were offering a starting salary, I think, of $32,000 a year, which it's not livable, right? Like they literally couldn't pay rent with that. So they're definitely, be mindful of offers that are just too low for your worth as well.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that we do ask as well, because so we've talked a lot about like the jobs that you wanted to go to or didn't want to go to or whatever, but could you tell us a little bit more about what your current job is? Because I like sort of asked that in email. I was like, no, it's gonna be better on live. I want to know there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'm so grateful and lucky that I found this Vanderbilt job, and I'll tell you first how I found it. So again, this is at the end of my job market journey. Like this was in May. This was after the coronavirus hit and a lot of the jobs were disappearing. And I was applying to industry jobs. And how I found out about this job was actually on Twitter. One of my friends sent me a message. They tagged me in the link of the job advertisement on Twitter. So I just want to also say, like, for people that are like, oh, Twitter is a waste of time, like it helped me get a job. So you can learn a lot and network a lot via social media. And it was this research position at Vanderbilt, and it was for the LGBTQ policy lab. And I'm like, oh, that sounds really interesting, but I didn't really have research experience doing LGBTQ stuff. So I'm like, I don't know if they'll even have a chance, but I'm applying to everything at this point, so why not? And I applied, and I got the phone interview and then the final interview. And basically they really liked that I had a background in social networks, because part of it's looking at how social networks impact the health of LGBTQ folks in the United States, in particular the Southern United States. So that was really helpful. And even though I haven't studied LGBTQ people, I do belong to that group. So I think that was also helpful to have lived experience as well. And being able to talk about that. So I got the job, and it was amazing. It was an amazing feeling to finally get a job after so many rejections. I mean, I was on the job market for 9-10 months at that point, and it was just nonstop rejection and getting close and then rejected. And then coronavirus hits and everybody gets rejected. And then I finally get this wonderful job at Vanderbilt University studying a really important thing that I'm really passionate about. And yeah, so more details on what I'm doing. So the project we're looking at right now is focused on older LGBT folks in particular. So this is a particularly vulnerable group because over time, unfortunately, there's been all these structural disadvantages for gay folks in the United States. Not being able to marry, not being able to adopt. So when you get to older age, you already have smaller social networks, but LGBT folks in particular have even more smaller, more vulnerable networks because they don't have long-term partners as much. They don't have kids as much. So on the aggregate, they're more vulnerable to losing their close associates. So one of the studies we're looking at is how that's even more likely to happen after major health events. So older people, when they have a major health event, it can shake up their network if they're in the hospital for a while. And what we found is compared to heterosexual individuals, LGBTQ folks are more likely to actually decrease their network after a major health event. So they're already dealing with a health event and they're already dealing with all these other issues, and their network, I guess, can't handle that extra additional force. So that's one of the papers that I'm working on right now. And then more broadly, what we're interested in is just how aging and social networks interact with the health of queer folk in the Southern United States, and also talking about how that applies to policy too. So sometimes we actually write policy briefs for Congress people and local state legislators. So yeah, that's what I'm working on now as far as my research.
That's so cool. I didn't even know that was like a study.
Yeah.
So that's
cool. No, that's really cool. And it sounds like it was also something that you weren't explicitly looking for, right? Yeah. It was something that popped up that became a really awesome opportunity doing really important work.
Yeah.
It's so cool.
Yeah. So again, to connect it, it's so there's so much randomness and luck in the process. And that's one thing I do want to reiterate, because this job, I mean, other than a tenure track job that's permanent, so this is a postdoc, so it's temporary. But I mean, it was one of the best positions that I could have found that was a postdoc. It's a really great university, it's really great people, really interesting work. And I literally just stumbled into it at the end of my job market journey. So, if you're feeling disheartened and you're I keep getting these rejections and get close and then I get rejected, you might be, just another couple days from stumbling into a job offer yourself.
Yeah. And I think that's like a great message to keep in mind when in the job search that, I mean, it's a theme. We don't know. There's so many things out of our control. There's so many things we won't know. But at the same time, like every day is a new day and you can get a new opportunity like tomorrow. Like,
Right.
right. And there's just, if you're putting yourself out there, doing your best and keeping in mind that there are outside factors, just be kind to yourself, knowing that you are doing what you can, you are doing the work to end up in something, maybe a really cool new adventure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, let's see, I do want to get to this one question that I think is important before we enter grad chat today. And it says, what do you do if your PI isn't supportive of your career choice?
Wow, that's a really tough question. I'm so thankful that I had a very supportive PI. My mentor in grad school was awesome. He was very understanding of what direction I wanted to go. So I I feel for that person because I know how important mentorship is in grad school generally. Um, well, I guess my follow-up would be, what direction do they want to go though? So if you want to be in industry, your PI doesn't really matter as much because you're leaving academia. So that's the good news. If you want to stay in academia, people are expecting that, they're going to write a strong letter for you, for example. But going outside of academia, you're kind of getting a fresh start in a lot of ways. And I don't think that relationship is going to matter as much because there is a divide between academia and industry. So I guess depending on that person, if that person isn't being supported by their advisor to go into industry, try their best to get some other kind of advisor, either informally or not, just to kind of get some mentorship. You can reach out to people like I did. I just would send cold emails sometimes to people that were researchers at different companies that had PhDs. And a lot of times they replied and they can give you insight and advice on what to do. So there are people that are just willing to help just because they want to, try to help people. So I would definitely look out for that. Look out for different advisors, look out for informal advisors. And even though it's really challenging, you can definitely make it through it.
Yeah. Always have multiple mentors, and if yours isn't working, it's not you, it's that relationship.
Right.
So unfortunately we have to wrap up. Would love to ask one more question here, which is kind of a combination question. Anna Beatriz says, I intend on starting a PhD soon, would also love to venture into teaching in the future. Is there a particular time you advise to start looking for jobs, like as a teaching assistant? So just in general, when should somebody start looking for jobs? When should we be starting this career process as we're going along?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's never too early to start looking at different career options, as long as you're flexible, right? Like you don't want to be too stuck in, like, I definitely want to be XYZ job. Because as you go through grad school, your interests are going to change. It's a near certainty. So be mindful of that. And you can always just develop relationships and start talking with, asking people about their jobs, what they like, what they don't like. But yeah, you can start modeling your grad school career based on your job. I mean, again, for academia, they want you to have teaching and research experience. But again, for industry jobs, a lot of those same skills transfer. So as long as you're working on a lot of different projects and doing lots of different things, a lot of those are going to transfer for different types of jobs. So no matter what you're doing, you can try to navigate a certain path. Let's say you want to be a professor, so you do teaching and research, but then you change and you do industry at the last minute. You can still say, hey, I learned all these cool statistical techniques or all these research techniques, or I learned how to lead a research team. Like, that's really valuable skills for these industry positions. So you can try to model yourself based on the future career that you think. And as far as planning a career, you can think about what you need to do to get that job in the future and what they look for in their applicants. But again, it's okay to be flexible and it's okay to change your mind, because a lot of people do. I definitely did several times.
That's awesome. All right. Well, we're going to let you get back to your regular day and also to exploring your new city. Is there anything you want to leave folks with? Any parting piece of advice? Just to be like, hey, whatever.
Yeah, well, so for people on the job market in particular, it's definitely a really challenging time, and I feel you, and I definitely can relate to being on the COVID market, at least towards the end of it. So just try to definitely take care of yourself, practice self-care as best you can, and work through it, and it's going to be okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, I guess this wraps up this week's grad chat about planning a career. Thanks so much for being our guest today, Matthew. I think I personally definitely gained a lot of insights about what to expect or how to practice self-care or what the process is like for transitioning and planning a career. So this was awesome. If you are watching this for the first time, this has been Grad Chat, and we do Grad Chat live every Saturday, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, I believe. So if you liked what you saw today, join us next week where we'll bring on a new guest and talk about a new topic related to all things academia, grad school life, mental health, and all those other awesome topics. So
awesome. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Yay, it ended. Woo! Also, by the way,